somebody online from the US, I would like this year's summit focused on the theme ambition, action, and impact. In entering a decade of low growth and growing crisis, there is even a new term which has been invented. Apparently, perma-crisis seems to be very trendy currently. The status quo will not be sufficient. The need for radical collaboration to fulfill ambition, ensure action at scale, and positive impact where it is needed the most is going to be critical. We are here to share our views on the role of the insurance industry in collaboration with the public sector and other stakeholders plays in responding to the increasing risk we all face. We are here to share the bold solutions that have been developed to deliver our ambition and to offer practical insight into lessons from implementation. I look forward to continue to exchange more about the action we have taken and the impact we are having as IDF through implementation of our programs and initiatives, providing the space for new ideas and catalyzing positive action. We need to continue the momentum, continue to work together and engage with others to prevent the devastating consequences climate risk is having on communities and society. I've been working for quite a while in large organizations, so by experience, working in large institutions, I know that it's not only having the right ideas, which is quite nice, but there is, because of the size of the organization, always the risk of reinventing the wheel several times. And in this kind of cooperation that we have at IDF, probably the risk is even increased. And I think the summit is in that respect extremely important to make sure that if we have good ideas, if we have implemented them in some places, that we do not reinvent the wheel fully in other places. I know that cultural difference and a few others make things that need to be adapted, but let's make sure that we take advantage of everything that we have done and do not reinvent the wheel several times. We also need to communicate better. We've discussed that yesterday already, the value of the insurance sector, and really highlight the unique value proposition of the insurance industry of applying risk management know-how. Aside from being chair of IDF SteerCo, I have the pleasure and the honor of being chairman of Zurich Insurance Group, a company that has a long-standing tradition as an industrial leader when it comes to addressing the convergence between disaster risk reduction and its insurance offering to clients. Therefore, it's with great pleasure that I welcome Mario Greco, Chief Executive of Zurich Insurance Group, and Ekhosuehi, IDF Secretary General, to the stage. Ekhosuehi will ask about Mario's thought as leader of a large corporate global organization on how he sees the industry dealing with uncertainty and new risk, and how to balance delivering positive outcomes and impact over the short and long term. Ekhosuehi, Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Well, good morning to all, and thank you, Michel, for that lovely introduction. It's really great to be here. As Michel said, it's really a pleasure to have you, Mario Greco, Group CEO of Zurich, here with us, and also hosting us in this really lovely facilities. I think all of us have been benefits of that and the wonderful weather over the last few days.
Unusual.
As Michel had said, the focus of this summit has been ambition, action, and impact. And yesterday we spent a considerable amount of time discussing the progress that we are making as an institution, but also as a collective with the respective institutions that are members of the IDF, both on the public sector side, but also on the private sector side. And how do we expand the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities to support addressing the protection gap, and also moving this agenda forward in terms of global resilience, and with an emphasis on public-private partnerships and also implementation, because that's how we get the job done. So, as Michel had mentioned, I think that many of us in this room are aware of the unique value and proposition of the insurance industry in terms of its applied risk management know-how, anticipating risk, modeling that risk, incentivizing risk reduction, transferring it, and that can enable risk-informed development. So a central part of the conversation that we've had yesterday and the work of the IDF is how do we bring that to bear in emerging markets and developing countries where there is a real gap when we think about the protection gap and the need for resilience. And it also exists in developed economies, right? We've had some of these discussions. And as Michel had said, we know that Zurich has been quite a leader in this space in terms of some really interesting initiatives and pioneering initiatives such as the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, the Zurich Resilience Solutions. So today I want to explore a couple of themes with you, Mario. The first is the insurance value proposition in the era that we are in. And we talked a little bit about some of the, not only the climate change, but some of the geopolitical realities that we have to contend with. So that's one area. The second is dealing with uncertainty and new risks that are being introduced into the system. And how do you contend with that in terms of our objective, in terms of helping to build better protection systems? So that's a second area of focus. And then the third area is slightly different, but really trying to, I want to get your thoughts, and I think most of the room, we are really curious to hear it about the balancing act that leaders have to take on board in terms of how do you deliver positive outcomes and impacts, thinking both short-term, but also long-term. But again, with the reality of the political context that we're operating in. So those are the three themes that I would like to explore with you over the next 40 minutes or so, and at the end of which we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience, 2-3 questions. So those of you who have burning questions, be ready to raise your hands. Otherwise, you will not be chosen. So with that, I say let's get into it, Mario. And as was said before, we are living in a world of increasing crisis, more complex risks, and we can get into that, the complexities introduced by climate change, etc. But from a big picture view, sitting at the helm of a huge institution, what do you see insurers and the industry making, or where do you see insurers and the industry making the biggest difference in terms of addressing climate change and the unprecedented risks that we are increasingly seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we are committed to work on prevention more than repairing. We think that the scale of this climate change issues is such that you need to prevent and avoid that it comes, because fixing it is incredibly painful. And it's not a question of money, it's simply that you can restore what people had before. I think about issues like heating, high temperatures. I mean, that's a totally different thing than high winds or rain, and it's very, very devastating for people. I mean, we don't even know what consequences will this have on children, on young population. And so this is the classical thing, that you better prevent it, or you better prepare, in communities, in different locations for that to manifest. Because after the manifestation, it's very hard to repair and fix it. So that's why we started years ago creating this unit that we call Resilience Services, which is helping clients to prevent, to anticipate, to prepare, to mitigate the impact more than paying a claim. Because we really believe that this is what you need to do now. And we don't just do it for our clients, we do it for anybody interested. I mean, one thing which is something we're very proud of is that we've been engaged by the city of Madrid to work on risks of high temperatures and how to prevent and mitigate that. And clearly, we don't insure the city of Madrid. I mean, that's not a typical client of an insurance company. But still, they choose us for our competences to help them preparing for this to happen. So I think prevention is incredibly important in making the ground, the communities, the countries prepared and resilient to the events which have an unprecedented violence. That's the problem. I mean, we haven't seen this violence ever before.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Mari. I think the point on prevention is also a very important one, and it came out loudly, very loud, in the conversations that we had yesterday, which is, you know, for many of the communities that we have to deal with, there's also the issue of, okay, insurance and affordability, but there's also a fundamental question of we need to reduce the fundamental risks that exist. And so it is positive to see, you know, the work that you are doing in terms of engaging both your clients, but also outside of that on this topic. But I would say that the reality is that many people beyond those of us in this room that are engaged in this agenda don't really see insurers as offering those products and services and support as an option. They don't see the engineering, for example, capabilities that exist in companies. So how do we really better communicate and make that more visible in our engagement, especially with the public sector, around the value that insurers can bring to this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I believe there is an issue with the public sector because I don't see the public sector committed, motivated, even understanding all this. And if I can expand from climate to cyber, that's even more the case. I mean, there isn't any. Our position is that cyber will end up one day being uninsurable because it's simply too big of a risk, and it needs a public commitment, and I'm not saying the private will walk away from cyber, but what I mean is that we will be able only to cover very low levels of cyber damages, and the work that needs to be done with governments, with public institutions on prevention, on strengthening the environment is significant, but I don't see any interest in That's a common theme. I mean, you probably heard what happened in the last 2 weeks in my home country. I mean, but the problem is that this was very well known before, that there was this risk. Nobody was interested to do anything. You know, after things happen, there is a peak in interest, and then it's already declining today. And so nothing is going to happen to prevent these things to happen again. And so I think there is an issue about what is the public commitment, what are governments thinking about it, and there is an issue about short-term and long-term, because these are long-term actions. You don't make an environment, a community resilient in a few months. It needs years of work, right? We've been working on flood resilience for now almost 10 years. And we made some improvements, but it's a long journey to really deliver results. Now, we all know that governments have a very short-term horizon, and so they don't, at least in my experience, they don't seem to care because it's somebody else's problem. And I frankly feel a little bit incapable of breaking this wall of irrelevance for the public sector on that.
Okay. Well, I take your point on board, Mario, and I think that it is a real issue in terms of, yes, this short-termism that exists sometimes within the public sector. But I think that for like the IDF, where we are trying to bring institutions, for example, the United Nations, the World Bank and others, perhaps could offer a portal where we could raise these issues, as Yoshi had mentioned yesterday in the conversations with the G7. The reality is that we are seeing lots of risks, lots of impact, so we need to take these issues more seriously. So I also think there's also a challenge, right, to the industry in terms of, we see this, but our response cannot also be silence or not really engaging, right? So I do think that, you know, it's an opportunity, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity also in the long-term interest for the industry and for society to tackle that. Do you think there are any opportunities, despite what you've expressed in terms of the challenges with the public sector, where you think we can still make some headway in terms of really demonstrating this public good element of risk advisory services and support to our clients, to the clients and countries and public sector?
Of course, I think, I mean, the more we can make people aware of what we do to strengthen the resilience of the territories of the countries to these events, the better it is for the industry. I mean, catastrophes are, of course, moments in which insurance make them show their usefulness for people, because we fix, we repair, we pay. But the catastrophes are becoming so violent that paying, repairing, fixing is really not enough. We need to anticipate and reduce this impact, because the amounts of people who suffer is amazing. I mean, it's incredible. And still, insurance is a small percentage of these damages. It covers a small percentage of them, right? I mean, all statistics I've been looking at say that still insurance is well below 50% of coverage of yearly events, right? So in more than 50% of the events, insurance has no role, and so people have no support and help, because I don't believe the governments will fix the issues either. So people are just left alone. And this is not just about poor developing countries. This is true even in the well-developed Western world, where people simply don't get anything if these catastrophes happen. So there is a lot that we can do, and there is a lot also that we can do by communicating the good things that we do.
No, I think you've made some good points, and I mean, when I think about the IPCC report and what we're seeing in terms of climate, right, and the fact that we might surpass the 1.5, those are very, I think, startling realities that are right on our doorstep. And there are, I think, some who might question the value of insurance, right, in where you're seeing increasing impacts. As you said, insurance is just a small part of that, right? And there are questions. So are we consigned to an ever-expanding protection gap, right? What does that mean for us who are working, or for you who are working within the industry, in terms of solutions beyond risk mitigation that could help us to deal with these kinds of scenarios?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different issues here. One is that, first of all, when a catastrophe happens, as human beings, we all expect somebody to resolve everything, right? Now, the problem is that, unfortunately, catastrophes are very bad, and they're very bad for a reason, that there is no restoration to what it was before. So you're not going to be happy. And so insurance performs something good, but it cannot bring the clock back. It cannot restore what was before the catastrophe. And so, although we put all our efforts in doing our best, the truth is, I mean, people are not going to be happy because they want their life back, and the life cannot be back, I mean, as it was before the catastrophe. The second thing is that, as I said, I mean, a lot of places actually don't have insurance available. And so when this happens, the negative reaction in insurance is even worse, because what is insurance doing? Right, but there are states in the US where flood insurance is a government scheme. You can do it as an insurance private company. So then people say, I mean, I've been flooded, why don't you pay me? I mean, I can't. I mean, it's a law, but then of course people blame me, don't blame the law, because they're not even aware that there is a law doing that. And there are lots of countries where there are these situations. So I think we should understand how bad is the catastrophe, and that we should be really motivated to go beyond our contractual obligations and fix it. But we should also understand that people will have, I mean, the distress for them is so relevant that no money is going to fix that. Yeah. And early communication, early prevention, work done before is what is needed for that.
Okay, thank you for that. I think, again, making the connection to our discussions yesterday, and a lot of what we are doing within the IDF is also about communication and risk modeling. How do we use those tools to make the risk more transparent and relevant to everybody, right? So that if it's from a political perspective, from a citizen perspective, from a business perspective, we all have a similar picture of what that risk is and why, and what we are doing to prevent or not doing to prevent. So that's an important point. But I want to get your reflections in terms of public-private partnerships, and obviously flagged, and you've said it, an important part of this solution. So maybe you can point to how you think such partnerships can help to address what is a deep structural issue, right, when we think about economies and exposures and risks.
There are limited examples around the world of public-private partnerships. They're mainly in the nuclear sector or for terrorism. I'm not aware of any public-private partnership on cyber or on flood, on water. The way it should work is that, I mean, what we have, which can be very useful for the public sector, is that we can pay the claims, we can fix things efficiently, quickly, and well. But there is a capacity issue. When damages are really disruptive, think about a cyber attack who is going to put, I don't know, the hospital system in Switzerland, out of work for a month. And that's possible, right? Or even likely. What damages is this going to cause? How many people will die? How many businesses will be completely killed by that? And so there is a capacity issue on these things. So I think there should be a cooperation on the financing of this, and there should be limits. And we, as private companies, can only get to some points of that, and we can get there, but we cannot cover everything because some damages will be just beyond our capabilities. And then we can offer our capabilities to repair, fix, pay, restore. But as I said, I don't see any interest in doing that.
Okay. So I'll pick on a point that you raised in terms of capacity, because again, we are talking about, when I focus on emerging markets and developing countries, given what we are seeing, is there really appetite to take on risks from these markets, right? If we are seeing climate change, impacts from ever expanding year on year, and is there really capacity within the industry to really take that on?
Yeah, it's a complex question because today cat insurance is highly priced, right? So you can argue that it's convenient for insurance company to provide cat insurance. The problem is who's going to pay those prices. If you go to developing countries, nobody's going to pay that. So unless there is a public support, prices are totally out of market. But I don't think, honestly, that cat insurance will ever be uninsurable. As I said, I think cyber has a risk of becoming uninsurable, but not cats. But the cost can be beyond the capabilities of private sectors, operators, or even countries in developing world.
Yes. So I will go to perhaps switch gears a little bit, Mario, to focus perhaps more on the leadership and balancing act perspective, and this whole issue of long-term, short-term. We started to touch on that a bit and the complexities introduced. You run a huge corporation, your clients are diverse, they run the entire spectrum, huge corporations to individuals. And we can see a lot of pressure mounting on the industry to ramp up emissions reduction, support the transition, while at the same time work with clients on risk reduction, offer products and services that yield profits against a backdrop of price increases and claims inflation. And obviously, we've seen the recent experiences with the Net Zero Insurance Alliance and the political aspects of that. So as climate risk increases, how will you balance this increasing demand from clients with reduced appetite of shareholders and some regulators to be exposed with these risks? How do you think about that from your position managing a corporation such as Zurich Insurance Group?
How do we think about that? It's definitely a very complicated journey, this one. First of all, we don't know all that we need to know yet. So we talk about transforming industries in sustainable industries, but it's not very clear how these industries will get transformed. And take even the simple energy issue. And we've been living in Europe in an emergency on energy because of the dependence from the Russian gas, and we're still there because we have not eliminated that dependency, and we've been lucky because the weather has been nice. But how are we going to cope with the needs we have to sustain everything that we've been created, which needs a lot of energy? And on the other side, we need sustainable energy, but we don't have enough sustainable energy today. So there are many unknowns at the moment. I mean, we work a lot with the cement industry. We work a lot with the food industry. These industries are committed to become sustainable, but they don't know precisely how to really do that today. There is a piece of technological innovation that we need. There is a shift that we need to make in agriculture towards sustainable agriculture and not relying on chemicals and fertilizers. How are we going to do that? And where are the economic incentives to do that? I mean, we've been working a lot on agriculture, for example. We know that we can demonstrate to farmers that 3-4 years after they transform their business into a clean business, they will be better off. I mean, the ground, will be much more productive than it was before with the fertilizers. But it happens 3-4 years after. What do they do in these 3-4 years in between? Who is financing them? Even if we give them, very cheap insurance, that's not enough because the investments needed to survive 3-4 years before the ground is more productive is much bigger than any insurance cost that you can consider. So who's gonna finance this kind of transformation? These are all the things that we don't know today. And partially, we don't even know how to do it because the cement industry has experimented a lot of ways to be less polluting, but hasn't yet found a way to have clean cement. And we need cement. I mean, there is no way in which we're going to continue living in this world without cement. We don't know of any alternative to cement. So it's complicated, to be honest, and probably I would say it's difficult to have a long-term view on what you're going to do. You need to have a very short-term view, and you need to adapt because things keep changing. So we commit to targets, typically targets no longer than 3 years. We want to reach this target in reducing emissions, in taking carbon down. But then there we go after that, and we will set new targets and we will have more actions. And every day we discover something more, or we understand something more, or we find more opportunities. It's a journey, this one.
Okay. And managing that internally, I imagine, is also a journey,
yeah.
Right? Because it's not only, you have to manage internally to be able to also engage externally how you do those transitions. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on, from a leadership perspective, elements around bringing institutions along with you on such journeys.
Yeah, I mean, you need to change the way in which you work. I mean, we have stories about it, and some of them are very funny. We've been discussing for quite some time about reducing paper consumption, right? And everybody discusses about it, but then nothing happens. And then one day we decided to commit, a bunch of young people to go and raid the printers and eliminate the printers from the evening to the morning. The morning after, people came to the office and said, "Where is my printer? I can work without my printer." Yeah, we survived. I mean, today we have very little printers. I mean, we kept reducing the amount of paper we print year after year to very low levels. But sometimes you need also to do this, I don't know, how can I say that? I mean, almost attacks to the companies to do that. We did the same with plastic bottles. I mean, we don't have plastic bottles anymore. But when we started discussing, plastic is damaging, eliminate plastic bottles, everybody agrees that plastic is damaging, but then when it comes to, you're not going to have a plastic bottle anymore. Really, me? No, I need it. right?
Yeah.
And so, again, we'll just eliminated them. And initially you hear people screaming, I need my plastic bottle, why you did that? My life is miserable now, but then you adapt it and you survive,
Okay, so
right? You survive without the printers, you survive without the plastic bottles, etc. The truth is, it's a different way, it's a different life it's gonna be, right? And there are things which are unavoidable. We need energy. I mean, that's unavoidable. We need to find a way to have the energy. We need agriculture, we need cement, but frankly, we don't need to print everything, right? We can write on, recycled paper, or we can write on iPads, or we can write on, devices. We don't need to use all the papers we use. We don't use all the plastic we used before. There are things that we learn to do better.
So I printed this at Zurich, so I'm hoping it's recycled paper. No, but I think that the point that you're making is that, there is a journey that one has to take externally, there is a journey that one has to take internally, but there are also moments for radical change, right? Radical positions that one might have to take if you believe an issue is important enough, right? And also radical in terms of how we engage with others on a topic if we believe that it is something that requires a radical shift. I think that is the fundamental point. So I'm conscious of time, and I would like to now open to the floor to see if there are any questions. As I said, please raise your hand very quickly, or else, Yoshi. Okay, the mic is
coming.
Yes, Mario, just a very simple question. We discussed yesterday very much, raising awareness of the importance of insurance, If we pay $1, we have a huge coverage, in return. But particularly emerging market, but also developed countries, people do not still understand why insurance is needed. And this is not only protection gap issues, but more fundamental insurance issue that everybody, struggle with. So just I wonder, do you have any thought that some people say ex ante is definitely beneficial for people and society, but how do we create this culture of importance of insurance awareness? Do you have any thought as not only insurance companies head, but also insurance stakeholder, how we can raise awareness of insurance?
But you mean in developing countries, in countries where insurance does not exist?
Yeah, or not specifically, not particularly, but also generally, developed countries. The same as you mentioned, catastrophe occurs, even Italy, right? Many people do not purchase insurance. So how do we raise awareness in principle? Do you have any idea?
I'm not sure I'm addressing your question. I think the whole industry has a structural issue on service levels, on service standards. The customers today have, and naturally so, very high service standards in mind. Because they're used to, because this is a consumer-driven world where customers have lots of rights, and if they feel that their rights haven't been respected, they have social media to complain about. The insurance industry has historically been incredibly, I would say, unaware of customer expectations, right? And so the history that everybody knows is that insurance is going to disappoint you, that the insurance is not going to serve you well. So, I mean, we have been working for 7 years on customer satisfaction, customer experience, customer feedbacks, and we made, as a company, I think, very, very significant progress in pleasing the customers. But it is in a context where we start very poorly, and the industry, I'm not sure, has made significant progress. So I would say that a lot of this is deserved and has to do with the service quality that we provide to the customers. This is a digital society, right? I mean, everything is instantaneous, and everything is, again, customer-driven. Customers have the power, right? Insurance is still acting as if we or the law or a contract has the power, and you as a customer, you're nothing. The industry has to change a lot. And the progress of change in the industry is much slower than I expected, to be honest, because there hasn't been real disruption in the industry. And maybe there will not be, because this is a protected industry, because it's an industry which is profitable, but not comparable to techs or other industries. But there hasn't been the expected disruption or the disruption in other sectors. So I think the fundamental issue is customers are not pleased. If we were pleasing customers, then I think it would address your question. Then we will have less of an issue on that.
There's another question.
Francis, you're not allowed. Who told you? Don't give him the microphone.
I've been waiting years.
It's a mistake.
Sorry, Francis.
It's a mistake. Turn off the microphone.
The microphone's about to go off. Mario, Ekhosuehi may have asked a similar question, but I'm going to try again anyways. And it really is about the role of the industry. Last week in the United States, we saw the largest insurance company in the country stop taking new business in the largest market in the United States, in California. That was 100% consistent with all the TCFD filings of all the insurance companies who basically say physical risk is not an issue because we write 12-month contracts. We can raise our prices or withdraw capacity. So they're doing exactly what they said they were going to do. And it's really an illustration of the role, I think, that the industry plays as a kind of that canary in the coal mine, right? The risk signalers. Now, I juxtapose that to 3 weeks ago, I went to an offsite with the company that I met here with you, Mario, Zesty AI. So Attila, Kumar, and the team took all this data, wildfire data, and actually came up with resilient strategies for 3 communities in California that is completely articulated the price, the exact steps need to be taken, a totally different approach than State Farm. And that's more of a catalytic approach, right? The industry's history, setting up Underwriters Laboratory for electricity or Insurance Institute for Highway Safety for automobiles. Which role, that canary risk signaling role or the catalytic role, do you think will have the most impact as an industry?
So California is a special case because it's a combination of 2 things. Is a piece of country, is a piece of land which is incredibly prone to catastrophes. Wildfires, flooding events, rain, and then drought, heat. I mean, there are so many things that can happen there, and they happen, right? Now, as the the add-on to this, there is a government approach that's saying insurance companies should become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which completely contrasts the evidence. And this is moving companies to abandon California, and I understand that. I mean, now we happen to be California-based with one of our company's farmers, and so we cannot abandon California. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for us. So we're trying to talk to the government there and say that it's either or. Either you make this land less risky and you take actions, or you make prices reflect the riskiness of the land. But thinking that private companies will subsidize the government forever and subsidize private individuals forever, I mean, it's a fairy tale. This is not going to happen. I don't think it's just about risk selection, Francis. I mean, the prices there are so off the chart that it's not a question of risk selection. I mean, California is honestly a very high risk for homes, for autos, because of that. And there is no way, I mean, events will happen continuously. I mean, there has been a lot of rain in California, right? So I said, okay, that's good. And they told me, no, that's very bad because there will be more wildfires as soon as the rain stops. And so whatever happens there is going to be actually creating more risks for the land and the country. they should need a lot of investments in de-risking the land. But that's not what the government is thinking of. They're just trying to pass the burden to somebody else. And what you see then is that, the private companies are leaving because they don't want to take this burden on them. So it's one of these complicated, but in a sense, it's epitomized the issue of where we stand on public-private ownership of this issue. The public sector seems not to own it. They say, fix it yourself, but I will not let you act. All right, so how am I going to fix it? I cannot refuse to insure people because they have a house in the middle of the bushes. I can refuse that. I cannot make them, pay more, which will induce them to think about, I have a house in the middle of the bushes, should I do something? No, because I cannot increase prices. So what am I supposed to do with that as an insurer? I just pay the claims, which, by the way, is not a great satisfaction because if your house is completely burned out, the money is not sufficient because you're never going to restart your life there with the money. You need to take the money and go somewhere else, and you're not going to like it. This is not what you expect. So that's precisely where we are kind of stalling in a stalemate position with the public.
Maybe I can, from my perspective, I think it really drives home this point, I think, in very material ways of public-private partnerships, right? And the complexity of getting them done, right? The political, the technical, the capital element of all of this. But I think it makes it even more important for us to engage because it's not only about signaling in terms of the risk, it's also about what you said earlier, Mario, about prevention, right? And so that is a decision I think that we have to make in terms of, are we comfortable with the idea of there is an important role on the prevention that must also be connected to this issue of the pricing, but also engaging the public sector in a much deeper way. I think that's the point. So there's time for one more question. Yes, please. Emma, I see it.
Thank you. Emma Howard-Boyd, former chair of the Environment Agency. I'm here with Ashrock today. Mario, throughout your questions, and I'm slightly building on what Francis said, you signalled the need for more activism and radical leadership. So what's holding you back as a chief executive of an organisation? What signals can we feed back to you that will mean that we act with even greater pace to deal with some of the massive issues that we're now facing? Thank you.
It is difficult if you are in the private sector. You don't want to be the lone voice in the desert, right? You need to speak to somebody. Now, I don't find that there is interest in the public sector wherever in the world, with few exceptions. I think Australia is interested and committed. I think New Zealand is interested and committed. I think there are countries which are different. So I'm not putting all together. But I don't see that in California, to be honest. Or I don't see that in a number of European countries. And I see a lot of finger pointing, right? Take again the pandemic example. When pandemic happened, the discussion was, why is insurance not taking the full cost of pandemic? Because we can't. Because pandemic is, by definition, something that the insurance sector will not be able to cope with. Because it's a general damage for the whole population, and that's, by definition, something beyond insurance. Have we then taken steps after, right? During the first days of pandemic, we all entertained discussion with governments about there's going to be something more. There's going to be the next wave of something. Let's fix it. Let's prepare, right? So can we prepare by setting up public-private schemes by which everybody will get a relief and support? Yeah, But a few weeks after, the interest completely disappeared. Nobody's interested to talk about this. I mean, I made a proposal with another company to the US government. The proposal stayed there for a month, and then it was thrown into a bin. I made a proposal with a bunch of other European companies to the European Commission, same story, thrown into the bin. So I don't think that if you speak in the desert, you're going to do much. I think we should just continue doing our honest job and, as much as we can do, create resilience, create prevention, use our resources to work with clients in making them more resilient and help them. Whenever these disasters happen, we'll try to, eliminate all our limiting conditions and fully repay the people. But this is a drop in the ocean, and it's not sufficient. And eventually, it doesn't do what Yoshi said before. It doesn't change the image of the industry because, the issues for the people are much broader than what you can do as a single company. And so I'm hopeful that you can give me ideas on how to wake up the public sector, how to wake up governments, how to wake up people. But I don't know. I mean, it may be my fault, but I wasn't able to do that. And I don't see any interest. If I call today any government and ask for a meeting to discuss this, even the Italian government, 2 weeks after the flooding in a region which created so much havoc there, they won't even receive me for that. They will not give me a meeting. It's simply that they have no interest in that.
Okay. Well, thank you for your reflections, Mario. I think that you have very much thrown out a challenge to the public sector in terms of, really taking this issue of risk seriously. But I also think there is a challenge to the private sector as well, right? Not only in terms of thinking about, the risk financing solutions bit, but also this element and emphasis on prevention because it serves all of us better. I also heard, an element of your reflection that focused on a journey, right? The short-term, long-term journey internally, externally, through our institutions. And then I also heard very much radical shifts that are sometimes required. And so part of what we are doing within the IDF is obviously to have these frank, candid conversations, right? But also to reflect as individuals about how we take them forward through our institutions, our engagement with the public sector, because we have lots of public sector. I'm sure they were fascinated by your perspectives, but also the industry, right? Of how we think about risk and engage with customers on this topic. It's been a far-reaching conversation. I also appreciated the fact that some of the things you expressed from developed economies, or when we talk a lot about developing economies, but they're also very present in developed economies, right? So we are not that far apart. So I just want to say thank you very much, Mario, for the conversation, very enriching. I'm sure it will carry on through the course of the day, and thank you again for hosting us. We will pick this up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you again, everyone, for listening and your intense focus during the hour. We will now move on to the second phase of the discussion. I'd like to invite Saoirse Jones from Zurich to lead us through this session, which will be on the need for greater climate ambition, private and public sector solutions, and it converges, I think, really well with some of the discussions that we've just had with Mario. So over to you, Saoirse. Please take us through. And by the way, we are in good time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If I could ask our panelists to come up, Mami, Ingrid, and Rob. And do we have Iyahen on the line?
Hi Ingrid, how are you?
Welcome, Iyahen.
Well, good to see you. I have mine.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, good to see you. Hi. Do you get in a minute?
So welcome everyone to our session on the need for greater climate ambition and the benefit of public-private sector solutions. So it's a nice follow-on from the conversation we just heard from Mario. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. For those of you who don't know them, on my left, you have Mami Mizutori, who almost doesn't need any more introduction. She's well known in this community. But special representative of the UN Secretary General for UN disaster risk reduction, big advocate for IDF, early warning, disaster risk reduction, of course, and everything that goes with it. Then Rob Wesseling, President and CEO of Cooperatives Group and influential lead in the flood resilience efforts in Canada. And in that capacity, also a board and member of Institute for Catastrophic Loss and members of Partners for Action Advisory Board. A lot of experience to join on there. Then Ingrid, as a member of the management board of the German Corporation for International Cooperation, and very instrumental in the establishment of the IDF Tripartite Agreement and other institutions and partnerships focused on climate change. So very welcome. And then on the line we have Iyahen. And Iyahen Zainab Adam is the CEO and Senior Director of Africa Finance Corporation, Capital Partners, with a tremendous amount of experience in emerging market investments, asset management, private equity, infrastructure, and climate change related financing products. So welcome everyone. So to get started, a little bit of context setting, although I don't really want to say too much more because I had such a great introduction this morning from the session before about the role of insurance and the focus on prevention as well as risk transfer. Today we'd really want to explore that a little bit further and the role that insurance can play in driving resilience, from supporting financial resilience, informing better investments in risk reduction, to performing a stewarding role required for the resilient, net zero, and just transition. So we'll unpack that with our panel and the broader risk management function. I'll start with you, Rob, if I may.
Sure.
The one in the middle. We've heard all the figures around the billions of catastrophe losses, the size of the protection gap, and the lack of investment in adaptation and resilience. The fact that this will continue to grow, the gaps will continue to increase, and yet at the same time, we've got a looming global debt crisis facing us as well. So it's been increasingly clear that we need to rethink about how we think about risk and how we communicate that as well overall if we want to continue to protect people and build resilience in our societies and communities. Yesterday, we also had the discussion as well about the importance of language and common understanding what it is that we're speaking about. So if I could open up with that, what does resilience mean to you, and how does reducing disaster risk support building resilience?
Yeah, so I'll start with a resilience definition. I like the definition that's in the Sendai framework, actually. And so I think about it in that way. And so resilience is about resisting, absorbing, accommodating, and then recovering from disaster. And when I think about the insurance industry, you know, the 300 some odd years that we've been at this business, for the most part, our efforts have been focused on recovery. So the bad thing happens, and you know, we help individuals, businesses, community, society recover from that. And I think we've heard just in spades over the last day and a little bit that recovery isn't enough anymore. In fact, we're not going to be able to afford to recover as societies, and so insurance in its current construct isn't going to be able to respond the way that we need it to. As Mario said, people will be unhappy, and for good reason. And so, when I think about resilience, and when I think about building adaptation and building that into our systems, my mind goes a lot to the other three pieces: to resist, absorb, and accommodate. We still need to have great products, and we still need to innovate on the products that are on the recovery side. But we need to spend our time thinking about those other elements more significantly if we're going to remain relevant as an industry. And so let me start to unpack that a little bit. Yesterday we heard about some really fantastic modeling work that the IDF is doing, tools that are being made available to sovereigns in order to help them understand the risk that they're exposed to. So I think across all four of those phases, that's critically important, and it's a really significant gap in understanding. If decision makers don't know the risks they're exposed to, if they don't know what tools they have available to them to be able to adapt to those risks, well, it's really difficult to get them engaged. And so I'm very bullish, very excited about the work that IDF is doing in that space. That in of itself is important, but it's not sufficient. There is more that we need to do. And where I'll focus next is on what we as the industry could do from an investment standpoint. So how could we use our balance sheets, our invested assets, to drive the change that we know needs to happen in terms of climate change adaptation in the communities that we serve? So let me talk a little bit about the space and the opportunity, and then I'll drill right in. So there is $150 trillion that are committed to net zero at this point. And we need currently somewhere above $300 billion a year to build adaptive infrastructure globally. I believe that goes by 2050 to about 500 billion per year. If only a portion of those dollars that were aimed towards net zero were focused on adaptation, we would be able to make a substantive difference in terms of reducing risk and making our communities more resilient. To say that another way, if we don't, it is very likely that we won't hit our net zero goals because we'll get knocked off course. When a disaster occurs, the long-term goals tend to get pushed to the side for a period of time while the recovery happens. And it's human nature, it makes sense. There's always going to be another disaster. There's always going to be another debt crisis. So there is we need to think about it in those terms. And so here's a question for us. So what if we could use the asset side of our balance sheet, our invested assets, to invest in initiatives that would actually harden our communities, make them more adaptive, allow them to resist and absorb disasters when they occur, as opposed to having to recover afterwards. I'll give you a very simple Canadian example. There is a berming system around the city of Winnipeg, which is in central Canada, that protects the city from the Red River, which floods often. That berming system was actually put in place in the 1950s. And the individual named Duff, who put the system in place, was massively ridiculed at the time. Because why would you invest in a berm? Well, that berming system, if you bring the dollars back to the same time frame, has paid for itself 40 times. It's a 40 to 1 return. Most of the studies that I've seen indicate that resilience initiatives pay 4 to 1 to 6 to 1 back. So this is an extraordinary example, but it's an example of what's possible. And so at Cooperators, we've taken upon ourselves in the Canadian context to try to catalyze a resilience investment market. And so we are working with a number of stakeholders, the federal government, provincial governments, the municipal levels of government, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, other interested parties, with the goal of creating an opportunity for resilience bonds to be created by municipalities and have those bonds funded by private capital. We've just released a paper along with the Climate Institute in Canada that talks about the tools that are available and the challenges of putting such a market in place. It is entirely possible, but it is a complex and challenging topic. As Mario highlighted, it's taken us time, a couple of years actually, to get the right levels of government understanding and interested in what this opportunity could be. But at the end of the day, communities that might have taken 30 or 50 years to build resilient infrastructure to protect them from climate change, with the injection of private capital, will be able to do that much, much faster. So they may be able to do that in 5 years or 10 years because the capital becomes available. And these investments will have market level of risk and market levels of return. And so I'll finish just on this thought. We at Cooperators have some experience in this space. 24% of our invested assets currently are in impact investments. So these are investments that are generating clean energy. They're creating hospital beds and long-term care homes. They're driving educational opportunities, sustainable farming activities. 24% of our invested assets are in those spaces. And those assets drive market levels of return, and they have performed better over the pandemic period. So the initial shock in 2020, the shock that we had in markets in 2022, they have performed better than their sister portfolios that are not an impact. And so not only is this the right thing to do in terms of impacting our communities in the ways that we envision are beneficial for them, it's also good business. And when you think about a 4 to 6 times return on resiliency investments, if we get this right, it will be good business as well. So it'll be accretive for us from an earnings perspective, but it will also drive the impacts that we want to see in our communities.
Thank you, Rob. And really interesting examples there that you've provided around the work that you're doing in Canada and resilience bonds and creating that market, which I think is a great segue to you, Iyahen. If I could just build out on that point. You mentioned that there's lack of flows and lack of capital going into adaptation and resilience measures, right? And how do we actually incentivize that? So Iyahen, if I could ask you, what options exist for institutional investors to increase investments in resilience building measures? And how can the public and private sector incentivize those investments further so that we create that catalyzing force?
Well, thank you so much. So I think just briefly, so I think when we look at this whole area for us or adaptation, we are an infrastructure and industrial builder. So AFC was founded as a private-public partnership with more private ownership in around 16 years ago, and we have profitably built infrastructure with a respected return of around 15 to 20%. Our debt is around 10%. We are an investment grade rate institution. So in the context of Africa, what does resilience mean? So resilience for us, we've unpacked it. For us, we have an asset that has annuity type of return when it's de-risked. So we've started, and this year, 2 years ago, we launched the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. So to go back to the definition of resilience, what does that mean in the context of Africa? So in the context of Africa, we have an opportunity actually, just like we have an opportunity to go green because we still don't have our power system. We face $2.3 trillion of infrastructure deficit. Most of that actually is still in the early design and planning stage. So what we are doing with the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund is that, and this is for us, what is the definition of resilience, is understanding the latest IPCC report. We've translated that and modeled that into a number of stressors, from increases in the level of sea rise, flooding, and drought, heavy winds that are affecting the Africa region. And what we did is that and adaptation is very location specific. So what we are doing is that we have.
Oh dear.
What's the right location for a port, and so on and so forth. So resilience means understanding the science. How does the science manifest itself into stressors? And then taking those stressors and really looking at them from an opportunity standpoint. So the Infrastructure Climate Resilience Fund aims to do that. It's $1 billion fund. We were very fortunate and very grateful to the Green Climate Fund for giving us concessional equity of $240 million to absorb that incremental cost of making climate, these infrastructure resilient. And then we modeled it. So I think it was absolutely correct what was said. So we have now our new portfolio that we are applying to. So what we do is that we analyze the location-specific stressors from the latest IPCC 6. And then what we look at is when we look at revenue in the context of Africa, it's a very detailed analysis, because when an asset shuts down like a port or a toll bridge, what happens is that you lose revenue for those times that you're not there. Government cannot collect its own taxes or whatever it is that you are collecting. It means, because we have a lot of informal workers, none of those guys will get paid because they are daily workers. So you have to quantify not only the time it's down, but the revenue loss. In the case of ports, which are very dollarized for us in the Africa side, and we build ports, roads, infrastructure, industrial parks around the ports, you would see there is an impact on revenue. But there is savings if you are able to integrate resilience measures and look at the adaptive options. What you would have is that you will reduce the time that asset is not performing, and that can be quantified. You also are able to see the impact it has on O&M. So the reason why we got into this is that we've seen that when a small disaster, a wind pattern, a flooding in a port happens, is that we spend more money in maintaining that asset. So there is a projections that we've made that we will save on operating and maintenance cost. So in that context, we have an IRR that says to us, a resilient infrastructure longer term it's more profitable actually than a non-resilient infrastructure. Now, so in terms of the financing, we are getting into it, we're putting our money in it. We are hoping that this type of structure will attract insurance companies and institutional investors to now favor it. I feel like there are few areas that are continue to be hindrance for this asset class to happen. First is education and knowledge. So we need to continue. This is an amazing forum today to discuss the benefits of resilience. As I said, there are some assets that will not have a revenue-making potential. So those have to just be made resilient because it's a food system or something where the revenue potential maybe cannot be calculated. But there are assets like infrastructure that make revenue that we can have a private sector adaptation models like this fund, the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. So there's a big gap in education, knowledge. Also, we would like insurance companies to consider, that's part of this program that we hope to work with insurance company to consider parametric insurance for these assets that are resilient. Second is the tools and the knowledge. I think this was applied. So we had to develop from scratch our tools to look at this. I'm sorry, I just got. So we had to develop all these from scratch. So we also want to acknowledge that the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investors created BICRAM, but we had to take the BICRAM and make it much more applied to the Africa scene. But we want to suggest that those types of tools need to be widely available so that investors, builders, developers have those in place. we talked about the role of government. For us, the role of government is absolutely important because we want governments to put first the education when it happens. A component of our program works with 20 countries to also inform and to work with them on policy parameters. So bidding documents should actually have a component that has resilience angles. We should look at the codes that are critical to the future infrastructure, because all these infrastructure will have an equity component and a debt component. If they are not resilient, what it means is that we're turning to the next generation assets that are going to break down, and there is still an obligation for the next generation to pay. And the last point is investments. We hope that we see some preference for this asset class. It's the beginning. The climate side has not really put in any money on resilience, very few. This is one of the first of scale in Africa. So we need to see the investment flows also to prefer these types of assets. So in a nutshell, it's a whole systemic change which requires education, technology. Also, there's a lot of first world technology that are critical to coming into developing countries or emerging economies in terms of flooding, resilience, and both from Asia and the West. So we need to see that flow of technology. That's the last point. So I think, to me, resilient infrastructure is the responsible way, the more profitable way to go. However, when you have a project finance structure, which shows you that at the beginning, you need to have more CapEx, unless you model the future flow, it is still difficult for people to understand. It's almost like, I remember at the beginning of when we were looking at energy efficient lighting, why should I spend more money on my system? I can't worry, I'm just worried about the CapEx, the savings that I will get from my energy bill. So I feel like we are at the beginning of this industry. And for us to harness it, there is a big role for this Insurance Development Forum to play in really articulating, in also encouraging investors to look at this. There's policy work, there's governments that need to be brought in place. There are some areas where the government, it's too expensive maybe, and the revenues don't make sense. Not every adaptation project will actually have a payoff. So we just need to distinguish, we need to educate, we need to change policy, we need to look at technology, and finally, we want investments to flow. Thank you.
Thank you, Iyahen. You mentioned the systemic change that is required, the flow in technology, the sharing of information, communication and awareness to help incentivize the flow of investments. Mami Ingrid, based on your experience, what other incentives do you think need to be put in place to allow for that increase in adaptation and investment resilience?
Go first. Okay. So I think we still need more metrics that can show. You talked about science. We need more precise metrics that show us what is the impact or result in investing in adaptation and resilience. And of course, there's at the next COP, we are supposed to reach the goal for adaptation, and hopefully this will help. But once this is done, and we need your industry support in this, I believe that we can have more, hopefully, investment in resilience, in adaptation. That I think is crucial. But I'm going to stop here and pass to Ingrid. Well, I think what's quite important is that we take a more holistic approach. When you look back, in 2015 with the Paris Agreement where we started, actually, at that time, the discussion about adaptation was about compiling a list of projects and starting to try to find the right funding for it. But this was not really an informed decision-making process within countries, because they had no clue what kind of risks they are going to face in the medium term, what kind of price tags are attached to them, and how they can actually consider the right decisions, considering, that they have scarce funding. So I think that the cooperation between the public sector and the insurance industry
actually brings a completely new perspective into the system. It's not easy to convey. I'm coming back to communications later and picking up some of the point that Mario Greco made. But the national system is, I mean, with respect to partnerships, that you have a fund and you have projects, and projects get funded and implemented. Now what this public-private partnership wants to achieve is actually changing the whole ecosystem. Working together is creating a new ecosystem for resilience, starting by investing into risk modeling, to have the information in place to take the right decision, then to start what you can do in preventing risk, what kind of responsibility individuals, local communities would have to take, and what kind of risk the sovereign would have to cover. And then you can use those financial instruments that are in place to cover the residual risks. But we have already shown over the last couple of years, by investing more into the right preventive measures and by getting pre-arranged funding in place, you can minimize actually the damage and the cost of recovery. But the second point is, of course, I think that the Global Shield actually leads the way in really creating these ecosystems by working together, starting with the assessments, and then bringing all the different instruments together. Insurance industry, the infrastructure, financing that actually takes into consideration resilient criteria much more forcefully than in the past. The big issue is actually how do we convince decision makers to go along that way? And we all discussed the issue of knowledge and literacy now since the beginning of the IDF, quite frankly. I think we have made some progress, but still not that much as it is needed. And this is understandable, because creating this new ecosystem, this is really a complex venture. It's not only about financing and funding. It's primarily about regulations, setting the right regulations in place, setting the right standards for specific measures, creating the transparency in costs and prices, and finally then establish a measurement system that really proves that the risk, preventing risk has a return, as you said, Rob. I mean, you have the numbers in place for Canada, but in many, many countries, we don't have actually these quantitative measurement systems in place. And when you look into regulations, quite frankly, we are going to face tough debates, but it's doable. I mean, in some countries, some industrialized countries, they have worked on long-term climate action plans. So they put long-term net zero goals, then they took it backward and said, what do we have to achieve within the next 10 years, within the next 15 years? What are sectoral goals? How much does it cost? Why shouldn't it be doable for the whole issue of resilience in the same way? How does resilience look like in 2030, in 2040, in 2050? What does it take? What do you take when you consider this backwards? How do we have to invest now in order to achieve our goals? And I think we need also to factor in what kind of regulations do we have to change. Do we need more mandatory insurance schemes? Probably yes, because we have to distribute the increasing risk to more shoulders, and it's doable. But mandatory insurance schemes, quite frankly, this is not an issue to convey. We are just facing in Germany a debate about new regulations on heating system, I can tell you. But this is one policy measure in order to achieve our net zero goals. So of course you could consider on insurance scheme what we could ask our populations to cover by themselves. Would we allow that some people think, no, I'm going to continue to be a free rider. It's much more comfortable. When the catastrophe strikes me, there is some kind of state, the local government, the national government, and they're going to cover it. I think we also have in this schemes of resilience, adaptation, we have to consider much more forcefully norms, standards, and regulations to accompany additional climate risk finance schemes that also have to be built up, and where we have to find sharing models between what the industry can bring in their capacity and what the public sector has to cover as an additional residual risk that can't be actually covered by the industry. But on those other issues, I think we always have debates. No? After a very big catastrophe in Germany, the same. We speak about more regulations, a different type of urbanization plannings. And as Mario Greco said, you have a big discussion, and out of a sudden, it's gone. And I hope, quite frankly, by working together with the industry, and that also the industry dares to be a little bit more outspoken, perhaps, about what is needed, and not only in the way that that is being perceived as, they want to grow their business by these measures, but really that you convey that this is a global public good we are working on and together, and that the insurance really can provide the levers to make it less costly. That's the point, to make it less costly for people and societies. But it's still a long way to go. We worked on literacy a lot since 2015 when this endeavor started. But we have already, I think, made some progress. When I do remember back when we had the first meetings with representatives of the Global South, and were very, very skeptical. And I'm so happy to see so many also representatives from those countries, and there are more voices out there that really bring the message across, and I think this is desperately needed.
Thank you.
Can I make one more point? I was inspired by what you said, Ingrid. I think one more thing that can help to boost adaptation is that we stop talking about the same thing in different languages. So what I mean is that disaster risk reduction means let's stop creating new risk and reduce existing risk. And we always say we don't have enough financing for DRR. Adaptation and disaster risk reduction, there is so much that is in common. And we say we need to, and there's a commitment, right, to double the finance for adaptation since COP26, and we say it's not happening. But sometimes the adaptation community is talking about this without thinking about the DRR community as if it's a different thing. And then if you bring in losses and damages, avert, minimizing, and addressing the issue is the same as disaster risk reduction. It's about preventing, averting, it's about minimizing, reducing, and addressing is taking care of the residual risk. And we say that, and it's important, but we need a lot of money for this. But actually, in many ways, the different communities are talking about the same goals and asking for different strands of money, which doesn't make it helpful. So public-private partnership is important, but even within the public, I think there needs to be a bit more coordination and thinking about how can we, bring the discussion together so that what is not enough for coping with all these challenges out there in terms of financing is not, distributed in ways that do not take us to the same goal.
We spoke about yesterday, and we heard it, I think also it was Veronica Scotti mentioned on the panel about this package approach, and we had a brief discussion about it. We need to bring it all together. It's not an either-or question. It is working on the same different angles, and we need to make sure that we continue to communicate and build that awareness around it so that it doesn't become a siloed approach when actually they have very complementary impacts. I did want to ask you about early warning for all initiative, but I would like to also build out on this theme a little bit as well, on the perception of industry, perception of the public sector. We heard actually a very interesting different angle. I mean, we're in the forum, we are a public-private partnership, so we're working with the public sector from the industry perspective, and understanding the risk awareness, risk signaling is so important. But we also heard from Mario some of the challenges that he faces in that dialogue as well. So what is it that we need to do to change that perception and really break down, perhaps, maybe it's a communication issue, but break down that exchange so that we can really have that open dialogue to work together?
Thank you. No, I was really encouraged listening to Mr. Greco say that he's committed to working on prevention, then repairing, anticipation, and reducing impact. But the other thing that he said, that he sees limited examples of public-private partnership, don't see interest in the public sector doing this. That made me think, and we need to think about it more, especially the UN system. If we're good at anything at all, it's about advocacy and convening. And probably we do need to, well, at least I thought I need to think more about how we advocate and convene differently, so that we can really become a conduit for better public-private partnership, on which we talk so much, but if it's not happening in the eyes of the private sector, I don't think it's a good thing. So we need to think about it. And connecting it to the Early Warning for All initiative that you mentioned. So this is the initiative of the Secretary General, very bold and ambitious, like this forum, to cover the whole planet. So not countries, but everybody, with effective end-to-end inclusive early warning system by 2027, including the most fragile countries. And this needs all hands on deck. So, and there are 4 components to the early warning system: risk knowledge, which you have so much, good forecasting and monitoring, so meteorology, hydrology, warning and communication, telecommunications, ITU, and importantly, early action on the ground, which is preparedness and education that we talked about yesterday. And to do this, what we are doing is bringing everybody together, including the private sector. IDF is part of this initiative. You are a member of the advisory panel. So this, I think, is a real public-private partnership. And if we can't do this in this way, we can't do it. And I do believe that as much as coordination is sometimes very, very challenging, even painful, we will do this. And IDF can bring a lot to this. IDF can bring your risk knowledge around the first element of early warning, especially, I think, hazard, but also the vast amount of knowledge and data you have around vulnerability and exposure. I think this is very important. And I just wanted to give you one example of the public-private partnership I heard is happening in Norway. So when I went to Norway, the authorities of disaster risk management said that there's now a legislation in Norway that all the private insurance companies share their data with the government, of course, in confidentiality, so that the government understands the vulnerability and exposure of the whole country. Now, maybe this is something that is possible in a country at the scale of Norway, but still I thought it was quite remarkable and it's working. So we do have these good examples as well, and I do believe that it's our task of the UN system to make sure that they are known and as much as possible emulated.
Thank you, Mami. Maybe Rob, if I can turn to you, what collaboration opportunities do you see to help or ways that we can break down that the difference in perception between public sector and the private sector?
I will build on Mami's commentary. In my experience, the biggest challenge is really creating a common understanding of what the risk is, what the problem is, and what it will be in the future. When I think about the flood work that we've done in Canada, I think about the early meetings on those topics, and government leaders really, they were confused when we said, well, there's an economic benefit to to building resilience and to putting flood insurance in place, and that was it was foreign, and it probably took us a year of meeting to come up with a common vernacular and a common just a common way to try to understand the challenges that we were facing. And it was years after that, before we actually had anything implemented that was that was de-risking communities. And so I think part of the answer is it takes time, and we have to work on the language. And people change over time, so you have to start over. You have to start over again. And I like Ingrid's optimism around when we started all of this in 2015, and we were in a very similar place, I think. And so my experience has been that that governments are interested if you can find that common understanding and that common ground. And I don't think it's just on governments. I think the industry has an important role to play, to share the information, to create the platform where those dialogues can happen.
Ingrid, with your vast experience in establishing those platforms, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think while perhaps on the mitigation side, I mean, you go to the Paris Agreement, I think it became quite early very obvious that you have to work together with the private sector. How you're going to change a mobility system, an energy system. Most of these actually facilities are in hands of the private sector. So there it was immediately recognized it's a necessity. But when you speak normally about resilience, all of a sudden this is all are looking into the public sector like the ones who should actually provide for all the type of resilience activities that are necessary. So this is one perception that I have seen throughout the years, that as soon as you want to bring the private sector as a facilitator, an enabler into the whole concept, people start to become a little bit uncomfortable. Either because they fear that, for instance, the impact of the climate crisis should be paid for by those that have provoked these increasing CO2 emissions, so there is a responsibility that's outside their own individual space, or they think, I mean, it's better if the government takes care of it. And of course, I mean, this goes beyond actually possibilities and wouldn't be efficient. So when you bring in the private sector, the industry, as I said, you create a completely new environment and incentive system. And this was actually the beauty of when we started to cooperate with the industry, because we saw that actually with your risk modeling capacity and with the different kind of working with risk, managing risk, it actually enables a government to create new systems and the right incentive framework that is needed really to deal with resilience at large, not only in pilots, and many pilots are not scalable, but really want to achieve resilience at scale. It's so increasingly important that the private sector plays its role. So in the cooperation, I think what it's important really to change this perception first, that when it comes to resilience, it's much more doing of the public sector. Secondly, we still have an issue when it comes to measurement and really to bring the message across that's much more effective if we consider those levers that the working with the industry can bring into the doing. And that it's not actually substituting for public activities. This was a little bit the fear. But I think we are not yet there. And what is very, very important that when we now go actually to our partner countries in the Global South and we work together with them on this new pathway where we really try to build up systems that start with risk modeling, prevention systems, and then recovery systems, that we involve the local insurance industry as well. We have to build up the capacity of the local sector alongside, and we have to give it more attention than we have done in the past. This would be one recommendation from my side. Nevertheless, I think this year is a very decisive year, because the Transitional Committee is going to create the new financial system to deal with losses and damage. Mami alluded to it. And I think it's now a very crucial time to make sure that what has been created so far in the different partnerships, Early Warning for All, the Global Shield, the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership, the Tripartite Agreement, that this is being absolutely also being considered in the financial schemes that's going now to be built up. It would be a missed opportunity if we now go back to the old-fashioned ODA systems where we create a new fund and we fund new projects, and the capacity of insurance and disaster risk finance solutions are not fully embraced in such a new system. I can tell you that the German government and the negotiators, knowing about the capacity of this type of cooperation, are actually working for it. But I think we need all your hands and all your voices to make it happen, including the ones of the United Nations system. But it's not a given, because there are still tendencies that come back to old-fashioned paradigms that are not going to really to deliver to people in the future.
So this is a very nice segue. I'm conscious of time, and I've got Kip threatening to kick us off soon. But it's so what I'm hearing as well, it seems to me that it seems to be about shifting mindsets, right? We spoke a lot about that. We spoke about the challenge of measurement. We also had some great examples that you mentioned, Rob, as well, that we saw yesterday on the risk modeling and the information we have available to us now that we can offer the public sector. We saw the Global Resilience Index Initiative yesterday, which actually includes an element of calculating the benefit from investing in adaptation. So there is work that is being done to get across that challenges. But to close, back on shifting mindsets, we need to be able to make that happen quicker, and we've got a lot of participants on the line and in the room. You're about to get to a call to action, so I'll go to you first, Ingrid. Can you provide 1-2 things you would like to see from the participants to increase focus on resilience and disaster risk reduction measures? What's your call to action?
My call to action to the industry is the following one. You have to show that you go out of your comfort zone too, and dare to take risks. And this, I mean, you have shown your capability when it comes to sustainability issues, but perhaps the next frontier is actually working with much more forcefully with the Global South and on inclusiveness as a next stage. So my message to the public sector and cooperation agencies, development agencies, is really to make sure that when we continue to build the system for global adaptation activities, and the goal is going to be negotiated in 2025, we all should really make sure that we build up a system where informed decision can be taken. And then absolutely must have in this respect from my thinking is we need risk modeling and analysis systems in place in each and every country. So my big hope, and I conveyed the message already a couple of times, so please don't only speak about the goals, but please speak about the underpinnings and make it a partnership of both. Because unless we have these underpinnings, we are going to invest a lot of money without really knowing whether it's going to pay off.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Iyahen, what's your call to action to the people in the room?
No, thank you so much. So I think fully agree with what Ingrid has said, but my call to action is in 2 counts. I would like to see even 0.5% of the large amount of money that's available within the insurance industry and pension funds as well as sovereign wealth funds to go for resilience investments, because we are all at stake. Emissions have no borders. The impact of climate also has no borders. So what is felt in Canada, what is felt in Italy recently, it's felt in Africa, in Mozambique, in Nigeria, which was underwater. So we have to treat our approach to resilience building and adaptation quite as a uniform. So I'm just calling to an asset allocation to the asset class. The second thing I would like to call on is for us to have some level of targets for us to have to transform our ecosystem so that more resilience investments and financing can happen. We have a Paris Agreement. We understand 1.5. We're trying to meet that. We're off track, but at least we know it. So some level of a global goal of increasing resilience would actually be great. I'm not good on the policy side, but something like that.
Great, thank you. Oh, no.
Makes us focus. So I think those are my two calls, but thank you so much.
Great.
I've learned a lot.
So for asset allocation to resilient investments and targets, global resilience targets. Mami, what's your call to action?
Right, so from protection to prevention.
Yeah.
So this is not about the industry doing totally new things, but please, in your policies, in your products, in your strategies, if you can embed prevention, that would be wonderful. And even like ex post. So we have found out through the midterm review process that building back better is not happening. Many countries, everybody is building back the same. But you have also with your policies and your products to incentivize building back better, which is so important. Ex ante can start in ex post as well. So from protection to prevention, please.
Thank you. And I opened with you, and I'll close with you, Rob. What's your call to action?
Well, there's a lot of them have been taken already. I'm actually going to be in agreement with my colleagues. My call to action for the insurance industry is to think about being in the resilience business as opposed to being in the indemnity business. It doesn't mean that our business has to do a 180 for us to get there. Indemnity is a subset of resilience, the way that I think about it, and that's both from a product perspective, but also from an investment perspective. There's significant impacts that we can make on both ends, and I think it will be better for the industry overall if we think of ourselves as being in the resilience business. My call to action for the public sector is, it really goes back to Mario's comments at the opening, and some of those comments were stark. He was trying to send a message, and I think he did. The public sector needs to lean in and take adaptation very seriously. We've spent the vast majority of our time on climate change mitigation. We shouldn't spend less time on that, but we also need to spend time and effort on adaptation. And the private sector cannot do it on its own. And so that's my call to action. Again, I'm not good on developing policy, but we'll let others do that, but that's the call.
Thank you. And you've heard it here. You know what to do now when you walk out of this room. So I'd like to thank you all. We've come to the end of the time. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and perspectives and bringing that challenge to the audience and the people here. So thank you very much. And with that, I will hand over to Ekhosuehi.
Okay, thank you very much, Saoirse, and to the excellent discussions that we just had. I agree. We should all be in the resilience business. I think that's for everybody. And I take on the point that was said in terms of, I heard Ingrid and I think Rob say, you're not good at developing policy, but you can help to shape it and drive it, right? And all of us can do that. So with that, I just want to say thank you for the opening session. I think they were fantastic in terms of helping us to think about what is to come this afternoon. But we're going to break now and return, if you can, at 10:45. So please go out, refresh. There's some refreshment on the terrace, and we'll resume at 10:50 promptly. So thank you.